All right, folks. Well, it is 7:40, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. The last time that you guys were here, we talked about the kind of changes of the Enlightenment, the legacy of the Enlightenment, and how the Enlightenment started to spread a little bit. We talked about some changes to the art and architecture. We talked about how art went from this Baroque style, which was very fancy, like Versailles, to being more neoclassical with the Greco-Roman elements of domes and triangular pediments and pillars and stuff like that. Here's another example right here in America. That's Thomas Jefferson's estate. And then, the other thing that we have to talk about during this time is that we see that in Europe, one of the things to remember about the Enlightenment is that although for Americans, the Enlightenment is really what ultimately inspires the American Revolution, which allows the United States to break away from British control. Remember that Britain was a constitutional monarchy, and that the territories here in America were colonies of Britain. And what that means is that the British came over, they settled in these regions with the intent of extracting wealth from these regions and bringing them back to Britain. The Enlightenment encouraged the colonists who were living here to break away from Britain and establish their own country with a democratic government. However, the thing to keep in mind about the Enlightenment is that many of the Enlightenment philosophers were not actually technically advocating for democracy or even a republic, a representative democracy, with the exception of maybe a handful. But the vast majority of them were actually trying to change the systems that existed within Europe from within. So in the majority of Europe, and that includes France, where most of these Enlightenment philosophers came from, they were actually advocating for changing the system from the top down. They weren't looking to instigate revolutions and overthrow society and put into place a whole bunch of crazy radical changes. Okay, the Enlightenment philosophers were encouraging people to take a look at how society functioned, make changes to society, but not overthrow the existing structure that people understood, which in Europe was absolute monarchies for the most part. Not Britain, but the vast majority of Europe had these absolute monarchies led by kings. And so when we talk about this next section here, talking about what become known as enlightened despots, we are talking about kings who adopted Enlightenment ideas in an effort to govern their countries better, their kingdoms better, right? So many philosophers thought that monarchy was the best form of government, and this should have an H in there. Anyway, many philosophers thought that monarchy was the... Sorry about that, folks. I apologize. Are we back? Is it going to disconnect again? Is everybody able to hear me now? Check, check, 1, 2. Okay. I'm not really sure what's going on. It keeps on saying that it's disconnecting, reconnecting, disconnecting, reconnecting over here. So anyway, all right. The point being that I was trying to make, okay, is that a lot of these Enlightenment philosophers, there's not much I can do about the screen being blurry. Sorry, man. I can't do anything about that side of things. The internet, I think, is bad here at the school for whatever reason today. A lot of teachers this morning I saw were sending emails about Google Drive being down and other things like that. So I can try changing the quality. I can't guarantee that it'll work. Settings, output, video. I'm not able to change it. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm not able to. I'm not able to change that while it's already streaming, guys. Sorry. So anyhow, a lot of these philosophes. Okay, let's just hit the reset button a little bit here. A lot of these philosophes want to change from the top down. They didn't want to instigate democratic revolutions in their countries and overthrow the kings and topple governments and stuff. That's not what their goal was. These philosophes were trying to get changes from the top down and have kind of philosopher king type people ruling them. And these are the idea behind it, an enlightened despot. And an enlightened despot is an absolute ruler. A despot is a king, like an absolute ruler, but one who embraces the Enlightenment philosophies. And you might think that that seems a little bit unusual, right? Because how is a king going to be enlightened? Those things seem like they would be counterintuitive to one another, but basically a despot is an absolute ruler, and an absolute monarchy is the type of government. And many of these absolute monarchies across Europe ended up having what we call enlightened despots. Now, you have to understand that although they supported ideas of the Enlightenment, it was for their own benefit. See, if they embrace reforms, they appeal to people who are pressuring for reforms, and the king would rather be the person who bestows the reforms on society rather than to resist reforming and then be overthrown. So you have to understand that although these despots are absolute rulers who have no intention of giving up their power, all right, the fact of the matter is that they embrace the Enlightenment because it's a way of being able to retain onto the existing structure of absolute monarchy in Europe and continue to sit on the throne and be the one that gives privileges to people rather than waiting to be overthrown. So these rulers supported the ideas but had no intention of giving up their power. They wanted to make the country stronger, and they wanted to make their rule more effective. All right, the first, I'm going to give you some examples of some well-known enlightened despots in European history. And the first one is this guy, Frederick the Great. And he was a king of a place called Prussia. Now, if you've never heard of Prussia before, Prussia turns into Germany, okay? Prussia was one of about, I don't know, at that time, maybe about 300 or so states in what was known as the Holy Roman Empire. And King Frederick II was part of a dynasty called the Hohenzollern dynasty. And Frederick II was it's one of the better known kings. Prussia is a rising military power by this point. Keep in mind, again, as I said, Prussia turns into Germany about a century after his rule. So Prussia is very much like a rising European power at this time. And Frederick II also gets nicknamed Frederick the Great. He was first servant of the state. And he granted religious freedoms. He reduced censorship. He improved education. He abolished torture. And although he hated serfdom, which is where wealthy landowners take advantage of poor peasants that are tied to the land, it's like barely a step above slavery, he didn't change it. He doesn't like serfdom, but he felt like Prussia wasn't ready to get rid of serfdom. He calls himself first servant of the state because he views it as his role to improve the functioning of the state, to also centralize his power, and also to be the one who is making the changes, who is making the reforms. You understand that if Frederick the Great is the one at the top of the social chain, of the political chain, and he's the one doing the granting, and he's the one reducing censorship, he's the one who retains control. He would rather do that than wait till the point where people were so frustrated and angry because the king was holding on to his power and unwilling to give it up, and then get overthrown, right? You'd rather be the one that gives the changes rather than resist making changes and then risk being, taken out of power. So here is Frederick the Great. The next major Enlightenment philosopher that we have to talk about is a guy named Joseph II. Now, unlike Frederick the Great, you'll notice that Joseph II doesn't have the Great next to his title, and that's because he's maybe the not-so-great. Although Joseph II goes down as being one of the most reform-minded enlightened despots of his day, he does not really go down as a very successful ruler, because most of the changes that he made, which included things like introducing freedom of press, supporting freedom of worship and religious toleration, even for Protestants, Jews, and Orthodox Christians. He abolished serfdom. He ordered peasants to be paid for their labor with cash, so he's instituting like wage labor. Most of these reforms end up ultimately getting undone when he died, because the other part about these kings who embrace the Enlightenment is you don't want to make too many reforms too quickly, okay? You don't want to make too many reforms too quickly. What can happen in that scenario is you actually have the opposite reaction, which is the nobles get angry that you're making so many changes that they start calling you out for being too progressive. And this is kind of what happens in Austria, where Joseph II was king. And the nobles come out pretty strongly against Joseph II, and he already knows. In fact, there's kind of a sad story about Joseph II that I thought I would share with you. Joseph II, he knew that the nobles didn't like the changes that he was making, that some of these nobles thought it was just too much change too quickly. And so he knew that when he died, a lot of these changes would be taken away. But he didn't care, because he was doing what he felt was principled and the best thing to do for Austria at the time. And so one time, for his own epitaph, which is the message that they carve onto your tombstone when you die, for his own epitaph, he one time suggested, they ought to write on my gravestone, "Here lies Joseph II, who failed in all he undertook," which is a rather sad, it's a rather sad story, because he knew that the changes that he was making would not ultimately last. But even though they didn't last in his time, of course, which was in the late 1700s, they nonetheless do carry into they do get undone, but then in future generations they get they resurface, right? So if we look at Austria today, Austria has a westernized government, and they have, to my knowledge at least, freedom of press. I don't know if they have complete freedom of speech, but a lot of the more of the liberal Enlightenment ideas have been adopted by most places in Europe. So I would assume that Austria is one of them. And then another well-known enlightened despot came from Russia, and her name was Catherine the Great. So all three of these are absolute monarchs who embraced Enlightenment principles to improve the prestige of their rule, to set an example about introducing reforms that are liberally minded and stuff, even in a time when Europe's governments were largely still authoritarian in nature. Catherine II was a ruler of Russia from 1762 to 1796. If we're telling the truth about Catherine the Great, she's not Russian. She married into the Russian family. She's actually from Germany. And so she was a German princess. She married Peter III, Tsar Peter III of Russia. And the Tsar, not long after their marriage, ended up dying. And it's suspected that probably she had her husband killed. He was not really well liked anyway, and he was kind of weak as a ruler. But the Russians and the nobility really liked Catherine the Great. And she was an absolute authority. She sought to reform some of the state institutions of Russia at this time. For example, she formed a commission and suggested religious freedom and abolishing torture and capital punishment. But she was much more of a talker than a walker, if that makes sense. She could talk the talk, but didn't quite walk the walk. She was one of these women who was incredibly powerful in her time, a huge patron of the arts. She created what became known as the Hermitage Museum. There was a lot of art commissioned and purchased by Russia under Catherine the Great, and they established this museum, her personal museum, which now you can go to in St. Petersburg. But she doesn't really, in terms of the reforms that she likes to talk about, she doesn't really like following through on them. But so the extent to which Catherine the Great is a truly enlightened ruler is definitely arguable. On one hand, there's kind of like the patronage side of things when it comes to the Enlightenment, which is important, but then the other part of it is the reform, and she's pretty light on reform. Okay, for example, there was an uprising of the serfs. Now, prior to this uprising of the serfs that happens in 1773, this uprising became known as the Pugachev Rebellion. And the Pugachev Rebellion, here's the thing about it. Before it happens, Catherine the Great had been kind of thinking to herself, maybe we should get rid of serfdom. It's kind of an old, archaic, medieval system, and it's not very nice to people. So Catherine the Great had been wanting to get rid of serfdom, but after this serf uprising, she immediately changes her mind, and she's like, well, my goodness, we can't have the serfs uprising anymore. And instead of giving the serfs more rights, she actually ends up giving the nobles complete power over their own serfs for fear of losing the throne, because she didn't want more peasant uprisings happening on her watch and potentially threatening the stability of the state. So serfs, actually, their condition worsens under Catherine the Great, despite the fact that she ends up kind of going down as an enlightened ruler. We could definitely say that it's not because she made all these reforms that improved the position of poor people in Europe or in Russia. The other thing that Catherine the Great does, though, that gets her the title the Great, is that she goes to war with the Ottoman Turks and the Poles, and she expands Russian territory significantly during her reign. And so Russia's lands extend further west and further south as a product of Catherine the Great's rule. And remember, as I said, she was not technically Russian, she was actually German, but she kind of gets adopted as a beloved figure of Russian history. All right? The last part of today's class is basically talking about how the Enlightenment manifests over here in the colonies, in the American colonies, in the American Revolution. And so, here's the thing that's really interesting. America had been forming since, the early 1600s. The territories of what is now the United States had been being settled, colonized, since the 1600s, the early 1600s, about 1607. So from 1607 all the way up until 1776, so that's about, 170 years, all right? About 170 years. These territories had been developing as English colonies. And during that time, there had been a lot of changes in Europe. In that 170 years, it's a relatively long time, okay? In that 170 years, England had gone through the English Civil War. They had had the Glorious Revolution. They had signed the English Bill of Rights, and had gone through a number of conflicts with France. And so, you know, what is interesting about this is that by all accounts, most Europeans probably would have looked at England as being the most progressive in terms of having a constitutional monarchy, in terms of embracing Enlightenment ideas to an extent. But despite all of that, the colonists here in the North American English colonies start to begin accusing England of tyranny. And we've talked about tyranny before. It's an unfair and overpowering government or leader. And the leader of England at this time is King George III. Now, don't get that guy confused with George Washington or anything like that. They're not at all the same person. George III is an English monarch, and he became King of England, right, in 1760. And George III, you know, was kind of trying to hold the English colonies in America more accountable, all right? The English colonies in America had been growing rapidly. So in the last, you know, from 1700 to 1770, in 70 years, the population had gone from about 250,000 people to nearly, you know, 10 times that amount, right? So it's growing significantly. The population's growing massively at this time. And we could say that starting right around the American Revolution, this kind of new identity starts to form for those people living in these colonies, in these North American colonies. People very much started to subscribe to the idea of, well, I'm not, you know, English, but I'm Virginian, or I'm Massachusettsian, or I'm whatever, okay? And they kind of start to identify by their colonial titles. Now, ironically, this only happens right, and I mean right on the eve of the American Revolution. And not even everybody takes on these identities. Some people remain very proud to be part of, you know, the English Empire or the British Empire at this time. Okay, so, you know, not everybody in the American colonies jumped on board with the idea of revolting against England, but nonetheless, you know, the reason that this revolt ends up happening is because of a number of conflicts with France that ultimately the colonists benefited from but did not want to pay for, and also because the colonists had gotten very used to kind of operating on their own economically and didn't want to be held accountable the way that the king, George III, wants to hold them accountable. So each of these colonies had their own local individual government, and the French and Indian War is really the most important conflict that led to the American Revolution. So let's just talk a little bit about what that is. 1754, England and France start fighting in North America. And when we say the French and Indian War, please understand that that is not between the French and the Indians. That's the English, okay, on one side versus the French and the Indians on the other side. So the French and Indians were allied in this war. To be honest with you, the French and Indian War is really not how it's most commonly referred to. It's really the 7 Years' War. In European history, it's known as the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War is just the North American conflict of the 7 Years' War, which was actually a very global war. It took place all over the world. It took place in Europe. It took place in India. And so, anyhow, this is an important understanding, this war, because this war is fought to protect the English colonies. Okay, the British spent a tremendous amount of money, all right, to protect their colonies in North America in what became this 7 Years' War, aka French and Indian War. England won the war, which is great, good for England, right? But the colonists start to become angry with England because England says, hey, colonists, hey, so we won this war for you, and we're going to introduce this tax. It's not a big deal. You're not even going to have as much of a tax as the people in Britain have. And two, they've been paying this tax already for the last 50 years in England. So we're just going to introduce this tax to help recoup costs for protecting you guys. And so basically, the colonists are like, well, no, we don't want to pay those taxes. And the king's like, well, too bad, you're gonna have to pay this tax. And so in Parliament, which is what P-ment stands for, I just ran out of space down there, Stamp Act, in 1765, the Stamp Act was passed in Parliament. And what the Stamp Act was, don't think of it like it's not a stamp like a postage stamp. It's like a stamp, like a rubber stamp, okay? A rubber stamp, like with ink. And this Stamp Act, the idea behind it was that for any official documents, and that includes things like deeds for houses or contracts or newspapers or wills or any sort of official documents of any sort, even playing cards and other things like that, in order for them to be sold or transferred or approved or whatever, they had to go to their local colonial office and get this and pay to get this thing stamped to make it official. Okay? And the colonists are like, well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to pay for this tax because it's unfair. And so the colonists have to pay a stamp on wills, deeds, newspaper, all the other printed items. They're outraged that they have to do this. And they start accusing the British government of taxation without representation. And what they're talking about there is they're utilizing some of the same arguments that the Enlightenment philosophers put forth, which is that if a government demonstrates that it is not protecting your life, liberty, or property, that you have the ability to question that government and to overthrow that government, replace it with a government that will protect your life, liberty, and property. And so these colonists were outraged. They did not want this. And colonists didn't have representation in Parliament. So when we say taxation without representation, okay, what we're saying is that because the colonists weren't allowed to hold positions in the British government back in Britain, which, probably makes sense because they didn't live in Britain, they lived in the colonies, and the colonies are not the home state. The colonies are just extensions of the British state. They're really not meant to be a new homeland or anything like that. Anyhow, the colonists they didn't have any seats in Parliament. So it would be like if Hawaii, located across the ocean, because they were located so far away, that they weren't allowed to have a seat in the House or the Senate, the House of Representatives or the Senate, Congress, right? Which would be unfair. Hawaii wouldn't like that, right? And so the American colonists, we had 13 different colonies over here, none of which had any representation in Parliament. And two, now we've got a British government that's trying to enforce taxes on us that we don't want to pay. And the reason we don't want to pay them is for a multitude of reasons, but number one, it's impinging on what they perceive to be their economic liberty. And so basically the colonists they basically used the argument of, we don't want to be taxed unless we're going to be represented. And that was a pretty safe argument for them to make for two reasons. Number one, there was not a chance that they were going to receive a seat in Parliament, so they knew that Britain wouldn't budge on that. But they're pretty lucky that Britain didn't budge on it, because if they did, that would have even further subdued them to the British state, because then they really wouldn't have had any argument about paying taxes, because at that point there's no political rationale to break away from Britain, because then they would say, oh, you want a seat in Parliament? No problem, we'll give you a seat in Parliament. And then they would lose every single election that they had because they would get outvoted by everybody else in Parliament. So it's actually a pretty convenient argument for them to make, because they knew that they wouldn't get a seat in Parliament. And so even if, frankly, they didn't even really want that, because if they would have gotten a seat in Parliament, that would have adhered them to what the British Parliament said then, and then they really wouldn't have had grounds to break away from Britain and establish their independence. Things kind of settled down. Eventually, the British kind of got rid of the Stamp Act. They rescinded it, and they're like, but that doesn't mean that we can't tax you again at some point in the future. And then things heated back up again in 1773 with something called the Boston Tea Party. And this is when a bunch of colonists, for whatever reason, it didn't fool anyone, they dressed up as Native Americans, and they went to Boston Harbor, which was at the time the most profitable harbor on the East Coast, and they loaded a British ship, or they boarded a British ship, rather, that was loaded up with tea, and they took the tea and they dumped it in the harbor. And, it might seem like, not that big of a deal, dumping tea in the harbor, but the British care a lot about their tea. And then number two, it was not a small amount of tea that they dumped in the harbor. We're talking about like millions and millions of dollars worth of tea at the time. And so this immediately infuriates George III, the King of England. And as a punishment to the colonists, which was a big punishment because the colonists relied heavily on their shipping and their trade, he closed the port of Boston. And basically, this is something that pushed the colonists that had been kind of sitting on the fence. There were a number of colonists, like I told you earlier, that they didn't really want to break away from Britain. They were happy living under British rule, and they were not so sure that breaking away was a smart decision. And so George III was like really angry, though, and he closes the port of Boston as a measure to punish the American colonists and demonstrate his authority as king. And the people that were kind of sitting on the fence about breaking away from Britain, many of them get influenced by this decision to start taking up the cause for American independence. And radical leaders like, the Sons of Liberty and other people like that start to come about. Samuel Adams and people of this nature, Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Some of those kinds of, some of that kind of rhetoric is coming out of this time. And the First and Second Continental Congress are eventually brought together. We start to see a number of different, maneuvers made in the American Revolution, where in April 19th, 1775, British soldiers and American militiamen exchanged fire for the first time in what was called the Shot Heard Round the World, Lexington and Concord. And then the Second Continental Congress voted to create an army and battle under the leadership of George Washington. And of course, all throughout this time, these American political figures are using Enlightenment ideas to justify the revolution, saying they weren't given equal rights, or that their rights weren't protected by the British government, and that their rights weren't equal to other British citizens. July 2nd, 1776, Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, which was firmly based on the ideas of John Locke. Remember that John Locke says life, liberty, property are a person's three natural rights. That phrase had been around for a long time, and about a century later, Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration that all people are born free and equal to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I messed up that quote, but something to that effect. He's totally ripping off John Locke, though. And soon after, Britain and America go to war because they had to get a bunch of signatures, and that's why it took 2 days from July 2nd, when he first wrote the Declaration of Independence, to go around, collect the signatures on it, and by July 4th, we were ready to declare independence, and And that's why we have the 4th of July today. It's because of the Declaration of Independence, right? So they go to war, and at first it looks like America's going to lose because they are going against the most powerful military on the planet at the time. But a few things helped us prevail. American motivation was higher. We were defending our home territory. The British generals came in feeling a little bit overconfident. Also, time. Remember that they're trying to fight or wage a war over the ocean to hold on to their colonies that we already live in. It's kind of time was a very big factor against the British because the longer the war went on, the more costly and expensive it became for them, and the more difficult it became for them to hold on to the territories. The other thing, too, is just pure size, right? Britain's pretty small. The American colonies are enormous, or at least the amount of territory that the British were trying to capture was much larger than Britain was. And so that, too, is another factor. And then, of course, France, just to stick it to their old rivals, the British, decide to side with the American colonies just so that Britain is weakened. Now, after the victory in 1781, the 13 colonies had to come up with a new blueprint for government because now they're a brand new country, right? They had to come up with a new way of running the show. And the first blueprint for government became known as the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation are no longer in place. In fact, they were only in place for a very short time at the very, very, very dawn of the nation after the American Revolutionary War. Now, originally, it establishes the United States as a republic, which we still are. We're a democratic republic. But the difference is with the Articles of Confederation, what they did was it made the federal government super, 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 super weak. But it gave the individual states a whole lot of power. There was a lot of states' rights that were advocated for in the Articles of Confederation. And the reason that this became a problem is because it essentially put the states into competition with one another, rather than working on the same team. For example, under the Articles of Confederation, it would have been possible for let's say, Virginia to make a peace treaty with Britain and then ally with Britain against South Carolina or something like that. All right, so it could have put the states into war with one another. It definitely put them into economic competition with one another. And also having such a weak federal government meant that there was also a lot of threats from foreign influence. Keep in mind, when the American government is first established, America is extremely, extremely militarily weak. Okay, it's not like we just were, we came out of 1776 and we're just, like Mike Tyson in his prime or something like that. Okay, the American government was extraordinarily weak for the first probably close to 100 years of its existence. All right, and really was viewed as the other side of the planet, back of the woods by the rest of Europe over there. And so when the American colonies broke away, it was like, well, whatever they do over there is their own business, but we're not concerned with that because the center of the world is in Europe. And it takes a long time for the adjustment on that to change. But anyhow, there was a lot of economical problems. The American economy was weak. The American military was weak. And this government that they had, the Articles of Confederation, really put a spotlight on some of these weaknesses. And it made it really, really, really difficult to get laws passed. It made it difficult to protect against foreign invasion and so on. And so they were like, you know what? These Articles of Confederation are not working. We need a new blueprint for government. And that's where they came up with the Constitution, which gets drafted in 1787. And this is the one, after the Articles of Confederation fail, and they go back to the drawing board and write up the Constitution. This is where they start incorporating ideas from some of those Enlightenment philosophers we learned about last class. Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, these guys' ideas. Locke with life, liberty, property, and the government protecting those things. Montesquieu with the idea of the separation of checks and balances, 3 branches of government. Rousseau, and then too, of course, Voltaire. Voltaire with his ideas of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, All of these ideas get incorporated into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so this establishes three branches of government: judicial, executive, legislative. It uses checks and balances. It sets up a federal system, which means that the federal government is going to be more powerful, but that there are certain powers that are delegated out to the state governments. And in order to get the Constitution passed, they had to get 9 out of 13 states to approve it. There were a number of people that were very hesitant about it, but one of the ways that they got support from people who were sitting on the fence about the Constitution and creating a brand new government blueprint was that they promised to add the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution guaranteeing those kinds of things we were just talking about, like freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, etc. Right to bear arms, and then, right to a speedy trial, and so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch of them, okay? And so that gets added after the fact. So what's the point? Why do we talk about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights? Well, it's the first time that we see a government, a blueprint of government, a constitution, okay, put into practice. The ideas of the Enlightenment. We see these ideas of the Enlightenment written down on the Constitution. The Constitution is still in effect today, okay, and it takes these ideas and puts them into practice. And these ideas have been around for a long time. And, and they're still at the backbone of what keeps the country's stability intact, okay? And so that's why it's so darn important, and you better believe it's important, because we're coming up on an election season here where, there could be some pretty crazy stuff that happens, kids, from a historical standpoint. We've seen a lot of unrest this year. 2020 has been a year of pretty crazy events. And I suspect if 2020 is a roller coaster, we have not yet even gotten to the part where people want to scream and vomit. So we'll just wait until you see what happens in November here. But, if you're wondering, why do we spend any time learning about this? It's because it's what makes our society function, okay? That the root of it all, the Constitution, is the thing that people have some degree of confidence will continue to work. And we hope that it will. Right? So, anyhow, all right. Makes people believe that reason and reform will prevail. And this kind of optimism of the Enlightenment being put into practice with a democratically run republic, meaning that people vote, but they vote on people, representatives, to go and make laws for them. This idea says, well, what if we can, it spreads to Europe. They start thinking to themselves, what if we can do this over here in Europe? And very shortly thereafter, France actually ends up getting involved in their own revolution. But the French Revolution isn't just about throwing tea in the harbor there. The French Revolution gets a little bit crazy, and we will be talking about the French Revolution next unit. But that does bring us to the very end of this unit here. So, let me minimize this and pop this over here again. So we are done with the lecture side of things, right? Which means that because we're done with the lecture, we're coming up on the test. So probably looking at a test on Thursday for you guys. Gives you a couple days to study for it. We've already been doing some review with the online quizzes and stuff that we've been doing. I've got some other assignments to review the things that we learned about today. And so, yeah, we'll take the test on Thursday, and then we'll get going with the next unit in the class, which is going to be French Revolution. Just like last time, test will be available on Canvas. And so, but for that definitely concludes my lecture for today. And I will be putting the assignment that you guys have today up on Canvas in the next few minutes here, and you can get going on that. Make sure to sign into Canvas so that I can tell who attended class for today and stuff. You want to make sure that you sign into Canvas so that I can tell who was here. All right. if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them right now. But other than that, I am done for the day. Any questions that you would like me to cover? How many questions are on the test? Yeah, Jason, just sign into Canvas today and you'll get credit for attendance. You'll be good. How many questions are on the test? I don't know, probably about the same as last time. Around 50 or something like that. Arnav, I finished the quizzes, but can you check it on the web? Yes, I haven't updated all the grades yet. I'm still making my way through because there's been about 1 billion late assignments from folks, so that's slowing me down. So yeah, but I'll be updating grades the rest of the day here, pretty much. All right, any other questions? For me, the quizzes says that it's expired. Yeah, it was due. Yeah, it was due today. It was due for class today. Sorry. I tried to send a screenshot. No, if you signed into the quizzes, I can just see your score there. I don't need. The only thing I need the screenshot for is for Quizlets, not for quizzes. I'll be able to see on quizzes that you took it. Any other? It said on Canvas it was due 22nd. What? Are you serious? That's not true. Let me see this thing here. One second. Announcements. No, assignments. Enlightenment quizzes. All right. I get it. I'll fix it. Stupid technicalities. I'm making it due. I'm changing it then. I'm making it due for next class. I just clicked the wrong date. That's all that happened there. I didn't mean for it to be on the 22nd. I meant for it to be on today. Let's see here. Enlightenment. Reopen. Let's see here. You can't turn, so Neil, for the late assignments, let's just take a minute to talk about late assignments here, okay? There's kind of two different kinds of late assignments. Okay, first of all, let's clear the air on a couple of things. Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, just chill. Okay, hang on 1 second. Okay, let's just relax for a second here, folks, okay? Let's just relax for a second. I can only do one thing at once. So, I need to go to... How come I can't go to... There we go. Okay, now... Okay, I'm going to be crystal clear with you right now. Listen carefully. Okay, listen very carefully. All right. The quizzes for the Enlightenment that I mistakenly put for the 22nd, okay, but meant to put for today. I must have just clicked the wrong box a week ahead of where I wanted to, okay? I'm going to make that due Thursday at 7:30 a.m. It's going to close at Thursday at 7:30 a.m. Just listen. Don't ask questions. Just listen to what I am telling you. The Enlightenment quizzes that said that it was due on the 22nd is going to be due on Thursday, September 17 at 7:30 a.m. Okay? So that we're clear. If you do not do it by that point, it is not reopening. I need to be honest with you guys. Late work is driving me to the point of wanting to quit my job. Okay? I hate it. I hate every single minute of grading late work. And I'll tell you why, is because I've been organized and I have a ton of work and I make sure that I get everything done when I need to get it done. I've also been extremely organized about getting your grades updated, but it is impossible to stay updated and organized on grades when my students are not doing their jobs by handing in work. Okay, this is a bilateral relationship we have, kids. I do my job, I need you to do your job so that I can continue to do my job effectively. Do I love my job? I love it sometimes, but not every day. And I think that that's pretty typical. Now, so let me be clear on this, okay? This quizzes now, okay, this link is not going to work anymore. Here is the last chance quizzes link, all right? And we're going to double check to make sure that this says... There we go. Save. Okay, so now when you click on the quizzes assignment, all right, you're going to see the here is the last chance quizzes link. That is the one that is going to be open until the 17th at 7:30 a.m. And then it will close. All right. Next thing. Let's be clear about this next little bit here, all right? So, late work. Here's the thing. No, you don't. If you already did it the first time, it's fine, okay? If you already did the quizzes the first time, I still have those scores, okay? If you didn't do the quizzes yet, then you have to do the second link on there, and then you'll be fine, okay? As long as you get it done. Now, let's talk about late work. Okay, kids? Let's just talk for a minute about late work. If you handed something in, okay? If you handed something in and you know you handed it in, let's say late, okay? You handed in an assignment late. And I already put it into the grade book for the other kids, but by the time that you handed it in, I had already gone through and graded everything. And I have not added it yet. What I need you to do for me, if you have not done so already, I put a post on Canvas announcements, okay? On Canvas announcements. You kids have to understand I have 8 classes and about 250 students. It's a lot of people to keep organized, all right? Go on to Canvas, into the World History section. Go to Announcements. You will see in there that I made a post last week saying that if there's something that you're missing in the grade book that you handed in, make a comment in that, make a reply to that thread. To that thread. Don't send an email, don't send a Canvas message, make a reply in that thread, okay? And tell me what assignment that you already handed in that I have not added yet to the grade book, all right? That's for that scenario only. If you have work that you have finished, but you have not yet handed in, the way to go about doing that is to then attach all of that work to me in a Canvas message. And tell me in the Canvas message what work you are giving me. All right? All of that stuff should be attached to a single Canvas message. Okay? And the only reason that I'm saying that in this scenario is because there are a couple of assignments, okay, where there was no late window, which I am going to now make the deal, okay? Here's the deal on that. Here's what I'm going to do as the deal on that, okay? We need to transfer so that I don't go insane to a no late work policy. That means that if you do not do the work, you will not get credit for the work. That is where we are going, kids, because this is literally within the first month of school driving me out of my mind. Okay? All of the late work. Late work, late work, late work. Everybody has jobs, kids. And it's time to get responsible. I'm responsible, you need to be responsible, which means you need to do the work that you're assigned on time, okay? I'm not going to take any suggestions because unlike the American Revolution, this is not a democracy. This is a totalitarian regime headed by yours truly, which means that what we're doing now is we're getting things in on time. Otherwise, Mr. Knight's going to go insane. That's what's going to happen. So, get your work in on time if you want the credit for it. That means when something's due, get it in before the class, all right? And stop being lazy and get your stuff done because it's not hard, you're just not doing it. And that's how that's going to go. All right, folks? So, that's the story on late work. After Thursday, there will be no more late work. Thursday's the last day. If you have anything late up to this point that you want to hand me, send it to me in a message on Canvas and it will get added. After Thursday, nada. Not taking a single piece of late work. That's where we're going with it. Okay, folks? And with that, have a great day.